Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to wait for a few more people to join and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm going to get started. Let me start recording. Right. So, hi everyone. I hope you all had a good weekend. This is the last or second last lecture for this series. So I hope we're all paying attention and all of that stuff. There was a question regarding the test. The test is going to be on Thursday and Friday. Similar format to last time when you were writing for developmental psych, where it's open for 24 hours. And once you click into the test, you only have a certain amount of time to complete it. I'll finalize all those details and send out a proper email about that. Obviously, then there won't be a lecture on Wednesday because it is a public holiday. So make good use of that time to revise everything. And if you have any questions, to reach out for that. And it's on all the coursework that we've covered, including the stuff that we'll be doing today and tomorrow. Okay, so make good use of your public holiday to revise everything. Make sure that you have enough time on Thursday and Friday to complete it. And please do have a look at load shedding schedules. Load shedding might start up again this week. And if it does, and you're starting your test and then halfway through your power goes out, that's not going to be a good enough excuse. Especially if you knew in advance that your electricity might go out at that time because of the load shedding schedule. So please do make enough adjustments and time thingy things for that. And yeah, load shedding isn't an acceptable excuse for missing a test. Remember, this test counts towards your DP. If you don't complete it, you can have your DP removed and then you can't write the exam and then you can't pass the course. So make sure that you do write the test. And yeah, I'm going to get started. If you have any questions, like always, you can ask in the chat or just raise your hand. I'm going to put the chat in the corner here so I can keep an eye on it. And we're going to get started. Okay, so today we're going to be doing psychopathology, which is understanding psychological disorders. Okay, you'll see there that there's a lot of terminology that I put in inverted commas, and that's because nowadays we don't use that language just because it's no longer accepted or whatever the reason might be. So just keep that in mind while we're going through stuff, and you might see things in inverted commas. Okay. Again, Murphy is featuring because I've basically run out of animals to feature, and he is quite iconic. So I thought he could feature again. He's also the most unhinged cat I've ever experienced in my life. So I thought for psychological disorders that he might be appropriate. All right. Let's get the chat up. So the contents for today, we're going to be looking at psychopathology and what exactly we mean by this term. We're going to be looking at what abnormal behavior may involve and how that could lead to a disorder being diagnosed. We're going to look at how we classify psychopathology using different diagnostic manuals or other ways. Then we're going to look into the models of understanding of psychopathology. So the different ways that we hypothesize that psychopathology comes about. We have the neuroscience or biomedical model, which is kind of most of the stuff we've been covering in this course, as well as the cognitive behavioral model, the psychodynamic model, and the socio-cultural or community model. All right. So getting started with psychopathology now. What is psychopathology? So psychopathology is the scientific study of mental or psychological disorders. Okay. It used to be called abnormal psychology. So you might see in like very old psychology textbooks or even ones from a few years ago, actually. I think my textbook was the first one that didn't have abnormal psychology used as a term. The reason we don't really use that term anymore is because our idea of what is normal and not normal behavior changes all the time. And I think it's quite problematic language to say, okay, no, that person is acting abnormally because we are all so different and unique. Okay, we're going to explore 4 models that then four different ways then basically that people study these psychological disorders or how disorders come about. Okay. I also thought it would be important for me to now mention that psychology and medical students are prone to a very, very grave disease called symptomatis. That's basically now, since we're going to be learning about a few symptoms of different psychological disorders, you're going to start thinking that you probably have them. That may be true, but only a trained clinician can make that diagnosis for you. They have diagnostic tools, they have all these fancy tests and training and years of expertise that can help them to make that decision. You aren't there yet. You're a first-year psych student. I'm not there. I'm a 6th-year psych student. Okay, there's still a lot that we still need to know and learn about before we can actually tell ourselves, okay, no, this is what it's all about, you know? So if you do, like, tomorrow we're going to be talking more specifically about some of the disorders. If you do maybe see like, okay, I think I might have that or might have that, explore it with a professional. Your friends are not a professional. I'm not a professional. I'm not a clinical or counseling psychologist. I'm a psychology student. Do not email someone in the department and pour your heart out about it either. Go to the counseling center, approach a psychologist in town, go and look on, there's lots of websites where you can look up psychologists and get in touch with them. Okay, they're going to be able to help you. Okay, is it an actual disease or is that meant to be a joke? It's a joke, but it is actually something that is observed quite a lot to a worrying degree because obviously self-diagnosing is not a good thing. Okay, here's 2 memes about it. This online quiz says I'm depressed. Okay, I've taken online quizzes that have told me that I am brie if I was a type of cheese. So don't trust online quizzes, please. Okay. And then also over here, it's like definitely cancer. And then it says there, you stubbed your toe. Okay, my friend definitely has symptomatis and she studies psychology and she's feeling overwhelmed. It's very easy to feel overwhelmed with all this information. And it's obviously disorders are very, very scary things because they do affect your life in quite a significant way. I can attest to that as someone who has been diagnosed properly with that actual clinician route and everything. It is a scary thing to deal with, and feeling like you might have it is a scary thing. So do be sensitive to your friends. Don't be crappy to them. Don't dismiss them and all of that stuff. Give them the support that they need and tell them about the different ways that they might be able to, you know, go about exploring all of this stuff. We've also got another question here. I accidentally missed the touch on Saturday. It was on Friday, so clearly you did miss it. And I'm a bit stressed because it's the first time I missed something at uni. How is this going to affect my DP and my marks? If you've missed the tutorial, you need to please apply for an LOA. Okay, I'm probably going to host a catch-up tutorial at this point, but I'm not going to give you the catch-up tutorial information if you don't go the proper route of applying for an LOA. Okay. All right. So now abnormal behavior. You can see I've used those inverted commas because really what is normal, what is abnormal? Okay. There is no universal definition of what this kind of behavior is. Okay. But we have 4 different Ds that mean that we could maybe classify that behavior as a disorder. Okay. So we can say behavior probably isn't looking good. You know, it's could lead to something more serious if we see the following features. Firstly, the one is deviance. So your behavior, your thoughts or emotions are unusual. Again, unusual, how do we define that? Okay, it's just mostly we go on the substandard thing of like, okay, if someone was acting like that in public or saying that thing in public, would people, you know, give you a funny look? Okay. The second one is distress. So does this thing, the behavior, the thoughts, the emotions, whatever, does it cause distress to the person that's experiencing them or to people that are close to them? Okay. Thirdly, there's dysfunction. All of this stuff now is now causing it to interfere with your daily functioning. So how you are at work, how you are at school or uni, it's affecting your social life, all of that stuff, like those things are being affected. And then finally, danger. If you're putting yourself or others at risk. Sorry, that should be or. I always do that. I think it's my Afrikaans genes. But yeah, so basically deviance, distress, dysfunction, danger. You don't have to have all 4 of those for it to then be a disorder or for it to then be abnormal behavior. For example, if someone has depression, there's going to be a deviance in their behavior, thoughts, and emotions because they might have suicidal ideality. They might have feelings of worthlessness. Their behavior might change where they're sleeping more, sleeping less, eating more, eating less, and just functioning differently. It's causing distress, it's causing them like pain, and they're just not feeling like they're coping with stuff. It might freak out or stress out their friends or their loved ones around them. Dysfunction, it's now interfering with your daily life. So for example, if you're depressed, you have a low like drive to do anything. Your sexual drive is also affected. You aren't that motivated anymore, all of that stuff. But then danger, there isn't always that present at first with depression. Eventually, it could lead to some dangerous things, like you're putting yourself in dangerous situations. That's something that sometimes happens. You're self-harming, you're thinking about ending your life or something like that. That's where the danger could come in. So it's not always going to be like immediate, and some of these things are quite hidden. And then I added my own little note to this. This isn't like an actual thing that like some psychologist has come up with, but I said, remember the 5th D that creeps in, denial. Okay, sometimes people won't always acknowledge the fact that it's causing them distress or that it's causing interference in their everyday life or that they are putting themselves in dangerous situations. I know for me, I would often just, you know, be like, oh no, I'm just, you know, being a uni student. But in actual fact, I was putting myself in danger because I was not feeling all right. Okay. Deviance, isn't that a good behavioral attribute for someone not conforming to the Greek school of thought like everybody else? Okay, you sound like you study philosophy. Good for you. But yeah, deviance just means difference from the usual. Okay, it doesn't always mean a bad or a good thing, but in this sense, we are using it as deviance. It is unusual behavior, thoughts, emotions. Okay, our usual thoughts, behaviors, emotions should not affect the way that we are living our lives or the way that we are able to perceive emotions. But if it is to a significant degree that is now causing you to have all these other things, then we're saying that deviance isn't a good thing. Okay, please, I'm not throwing shade at good for you, all that philosophy stuff. I physically do not understand philosophy enough. So I have great admiration for people that study philosophy. Okay, just to clarify that. I'm a science person. My undergrad was a BSc. Psychology was my little dip in the pool with people and thinking for myself. And I turned out to like it quite a lot, but I didn't really have a chance to do the whole full 101, etc., things. So yeah. So yeah, Greek school of thought, all that stuff. Quite honestly, I don't understand that stuff. But I get that you're saying that deviance is normally a good thing, that we're not conforming to societal norms, but there are societal norms for a reason, because that is the best way for society to function and you as an individual in society to then function. All right. So now how do we classify psychopathology? So how do we classify disorder? How do we get down to the nitty-gritty and figure out what's going on? Okay, so different countries or regulatory bodies, so like the HPCSA, for example, if you haven't heard of them, it's the Healthcare Professionals Council of South Africa. Okay, they're the ones that are in charge of all the doctors, all the psychologists, all the dentists, all the physios, anyone that works with anything vaguely medical-ish, they are run by the HPCSA. Okay, so they will have their own rules compared to maybe the one in Australia or the one in the UK, the one in America or whatever. And they'll all have their different systems or ways of doing things. Okay, the two most common that we hear about are the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD. It's a document that's used by most countries. It was published by the World Health Organization, and it's currently in its 10th edition. Remember, it's good when something has new editions coming out and stuff like that, because it means that they're correcting themselves and acknowledging that they didn't always get it right. Okay? That's also why we take the stuff with a pinch of salt, and I don't pray to my DSM copy every single night. Okay. So then the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-V, it provides a categorical list of symptoms for all 400 mental disorders that are currently categorized. Okay, so this chops and changes all the time. I was talking about how ADHD used to be ADHD and ADD. It's now one thing as ADHD, attention deficit or hyperactivity and inattentive disorder. Okay, mouthful of words, but it basically says you can have the active, hyperactive type of ADHD, you can have the inattentive type of ADHD, or you can just have both, or just a generalized in between of both of them. Okay. It's currently in its 5th edition. Why is it in its 5th edition? Because in previous editions, they used to list things like being queer and gender dysmorphia and stuff like that as conditions. There is still a section where you talk about gender and body dysmorphia and all of those experiences. They call it dysphoria now, and it's more about helping the client to understand it rather than calling it a disorder. Okay, so that's why we're constantly trying to revise things. That's why we're no longer using abnormal psych. Okay, if this was your entire course was just this, they will no longer call it abnormal psychology. They'll call it psychopathology. Okay, classifying. Okay, some terminology I want you to take note of. So when you're reading one of these things, these kinds of things will come up. Firstly, a diagnosis. A diagnosis is when you're identifying a disorder by its symptoms and other evidence. Okay, so diagnosis is this is what disorder you have. Okay, the same as you can have a diagnosis of renal failure, you can have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. Okay, seasonal affective depression disorder, blah, 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 you know, all of those things. Okay, a comorbidity. So co always means that there's like a little relationship. 2 or more diseases are present, or 2 or more disorders are present. We can use disease and disorder interchangeably in this case. Okay. I took a note here, though, that there can be traits of a disorder present without the whole disorder. Okay, so when I was doing a clinical course in honors, we looked at how to do risk analysis for like prisoners, so forensic psychology kind of stuff. And we also did some stuff on how to basically map all the traits of someone on this graph. And then you could kind of say, okay, it's past the threshold of this, so they definitely have borderline personality disorder. But it's also in like a little section. So let's say the score is between 58 and 85, or I think it's 70 and 85. And then you could say, look, there's symptoms or traits of this other disorder, such as bipolar disorder, but not enough for us to definitively say that this person has bipolar disorder. You'll often then see, they'll say something like, major depression disorder with anxiety traits. Okay, they can often do things like that as well. Okay, and that's where that comorbidity comes in. It could just be, I have generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder, but sometimes you don't quite meet the full criteria for one, and it kind of fits in with the other one. Okay, that's also then brings me to a differential diagnosis. So that's basically a little section. I know the DSM has one for sure, where it says, okay, well, what other disorder could it be? So say I have depression. Okay, one of the traits of depression is concentration problems. Then in the differential diagnosis section, they could say that the differential diagnosis could be ADHD with depressive traits, or just ADHD. Maybe all my depression symptoms are as a result of actually just being ADHD. Okay, so that will be your differential diagnosis. Okay, this says maybe a different disorder is present instead of whatever, based on the signs and symptoms. Okay, there's a lot of overlap with lots of the disorders in their signs and symptoms. So that's something to consider. That's also why we shouldn't self-diagnose, because it could be something else, or you could just be exhibiting traits of something and not meeting all of the criteria. Okay, that's why it's dangerous for us to just jump to, this is what I have. It might just be that you have traits of that, or some things of it. It could lead to that. And just taking a breather and getting the help, the professional help that is going to actually lead to the right conclusion. Okay, and then signs and symptoms. These sound very similar, but a sign is an observable indication of a disorder. So I, as the clinician, as the psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever, I can see that within you. Okay, symptoms are then what you as the client tell me you are experiencing. So they are self-reported physical and psychological effects. Obviously, a problem comes in there where a lot of symptoms can be exaggerated or underreported, and this can lead to an incorrect diagnosis. So again, if you get a diagnosis you might not completely agree with, go for a second opinion. Okay, people do that with medical disorders all the time. So I don't see why it should be any different for a psychological disorder. Okay, keep finding those answers until you are at peace with it. And if you're still not at peace with it after the third different opinion or whatever, go to a therapist and work through that with them. Okay, just help yourself understand things and don't just accept things. Okay, really unpack those things with yourself. Okay, someone asked for me to go to the previous slide, so I'll go there. Okay, how do you actually fully diagnose what someone has, if anything? Can't it be that they are what people appear to be normal people walking around and their disorder is masked or controlled in everyday life? Yes, that's entirely possible. It is very tricky to come up with a diagnosis, and that's why you have to study so many years to be able to do so. Okay. Obviously now psychologists and stuff, through research, there's a lot more support and assistance in getting those diagnoses. And reading through the masks and controlling that people try to do to hide what they have. But it's not a foolproof method. Okay. And that's why, like, yeah, you need to train lots and lots of years for this kind of stuff. Okay, good example of that is something like sociopaths. It's now, that term's also outdated. It's now you just have, what's it called? Antisocial personality disorder. And then if you have that, you're a psychopath. Okay, and a sociopath could be like a subcategory of it, but we no longer say, I'm diagnosing you with being a sociopath. You're diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and then from there, there's different subtypes, okay? And sociopaths, in the traditional sense that we understood sociopaths, are people that function very, very well in everyday life, and they mask it very, very well, and that's why they are quite dangerous. They aren't always violent. Yeah, so lots of factors to consider. It's good that you guys are exposed to this now, but at the same time, it's always done with a lot of caution because of how people then start running around and accusing each other of being psychos and all that stuff. All right, I'm going to move on. Remember, this recording will be up on Are You Connected? I apologize for not putting it up on Thursday. I had one of you come and greet me on campus. I happened to be on campus last week and remind me to upload it. And I really appreciated that because my power went out and then I forgot that it wasn't up. So thanks. Okay, now we're going to move into the models of understanding that we can use to now then try and figure out what's going on. Okay. So the neuroscience or biomedical model, that's kind of what we've been doing. Okay, we've been looking at biomedical or neuroscience, like reasons for things to happen in our body and in our brain and all of that stuff. Okay, their idea is that disorders are illnesses that are caused by a malfunctioning brain. Okay, so if you have a disorder, it's because there's something wrong with your brain. There's three main things that fit under this biomedical model. Okay, it could be genetic inheritance because genes play a role in producing how our actions and reactions to the world kind of come into play. And it could also lead to your brain having some kind of deficit as well, maybe if your family has it. Okay, we don't fully understand genes. Very rarely is there one single gene that codes basically for a disorder being presented or disease, even other medical diseases and stuff. So there's a lot of things that play and a lot of genes that kind of work together or against each other to cause something in our brain. So we can't just point at one thing and have an answer. Very rarely in psychology are we going to have the full picture or the full answer for people. And that's why we need to be so sensitive to these things. Okay. Another thing is that a viral infection could cause some issues. Okay. For example, HIV, once HIV crosses the blood-brain barrier, it could lead to brain decay. And this is going to have psychiatric implications. So it's going to affect our brain's way of doing things and could lead to a disorder. Okay. And then finally, our brain structure or our neurotransmitter systems could, on a biomedical or neuroscience level, have something that's not working correctly. Okay. Obviously, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, we saw all of those and how they relate to neurotransmitters and stuff like that. The other example, Parkinson's, has been thought to be linked to a loss of dopamine in your substantia nigra. Okay. The problem with this model, okay, someone like me who's very comforted by science and facts and all of that stuff, I like this kind of thing where I can just say, it's genes, it's this, it's that, I can measure it. The problem with this model, however, is that it doesn't take into account additional factors such as environment and individual life experiences. Okay, so even though it's nice and great to just, tie a bow around it and say, okay, this is the reason why this is happening. Okay, it's something wrong with your brain or genes or a virus or whatever. This isn't taking into factor that there can be other things causing it too, or something that triggers those things. They all work so like interchangeably and so complexly linked and stuff like that, that it would be very premature of us to just like kind of say it's as a result of one thing. There could be so many other factors involved too. Okay, the cognitive behavioral model, they think that disorders are a result of maladapted learned behaviors and problematic thinking. So basically, in plain English, this means that the cognitive behavioral model basically states that a disorder is because you have learned a behavior in your experience of life and with people or whoever, or you have developed incorrect thinking patterns of like how things are and stuff like that, that kind of then lead you to have a disorder. Okay. There's 3 types of maladapted problematic thinking, all of that stuff. So an arbitrary inference is basically when for some reason you jump to negative conclusions based on very little evidence. Okay, obviously that's something that we do sometimes, like we'll say that we're acting a bit irrationally, or you're having a bad day or something and you just jump to that. But then, for example, something like anxiety maybe means that you have anxiety because your brain has learned to just jump to a negative conclusion, even if there's very little evidence. So even if there's very little evidence that you are going to die in a car crash, you now refuse to get into a car because you are freaking out about it and your anxiety is getting to the better of you. Okay. Selective perception is seeing negative features of events. So it's selective. So you, for some reason, selectively decide to focus on the negative aspect of something and focusing on that. And then that leads to you behaving or thinking in an incorrect way. And then that could lead to something like depression, anxiety, whatever. Okay. And then overgeneralization. Okay. So we know what a generalized statement is. So when you overgeneralize something, you jump to broad negative conclusions. So you just go, oh, well, it's that. And you just kind of fob it off. Okay. That's basically what you do if it's overgeneralization. This model, okay, it's part of the behavioral perspective of psychopathology. That's kind of where it fits in. It uses a lot of cognitive behavioral theories and stuff like that, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling. Okay, you might have learned about this in developmental psychology. I didn't have access to your course, so I'm not sure if you did. But I remember when I was in first year, my developmental psychology lecturer, Miss Natalie Donaldson, she's not here anymore. She was awesome. She took us through what classical conditioning is, what operant conditioning is, and all of that stuff, because obviously a lot of these things are learned when you're super, super young, and then it will have implications in your later life. Okay. So just to recap what each of these things are, if you have learned them, if you haven't, go and read up about them. Classical conditioning. So this was Pavlov. He did this. He did the experiment with dogs like below. It's basically when you pair an object with an unconditioned stimuli. Okay. And they hypothesize that this is how phobias can be developed. Okay. So just going through classical conditioning again over here. So there's an unconditioned response. So here's the dog. There's food in front of the dog. It is now salivating because it sees food and wants to eat. Okay. Then you introduce an unconditioned stimuli. So this has absolutely nothing to do with a dog's experience of eating things. But while the dog sees the food, you now start ringing a bell. Okay. And then eventually what this is going to lead to is, even though there's no food, if the dog hears the bell, it's going to make the dog think of seeing food, and then the dog is going to salivate. Okay. There was a what's it called, scene in The Office where Jim basically classically conditioned Dwight into asking for a sweet every time he coughed or something like that, because he would cough and then be like, Dwight, would you like a sweet? And then Dwight would take the sweet, and then eventually Jim coughed or did something, and then Dwight did this expecting the sweet, and then he didn't quite, like, he couldn't really remember why he did it, he just did it. And then obviously Jim then gaslit him and was basically like, no, why are you reaching out your hand, even though he knew exactly what he had just done. Okay, so obviously they think phobias then develop from this, where an adverse event would happen when you were exposed to a stimuli. So now every time you think about that stimuli or see that stimuli again, you're going to think of a negative experience and freak out. Okay, so that's an example of how our brain can kind of just jump to a conclusion with little evidence, or like overgeneralizing it, or whatever, one of those three, and lead to you thinking in a maladaptive way. Okay, operant conditioning. So this comes from that reinforcement punishment thing. So operant conditioning in the cognitive behavioral model is looking at reward and punishment. Okay, so obviously this fits in very well with substance abuse, which is what we've been talking about for a while. The reward of what a substance brings, it makes you feel euphoric, it makes you feel relaxed, you feel good when you're high, all of those things. We start associating that substance abuse with that thing instead of thinking of the negative sides of it, like, okay, then afterwards I want to throw up, or it's now leading me to not get to work on time. It's led me to have a breakup in a relationship because of my behavior. Okay, instead you associate that thing with a good thing, and then you want to carry on doing it. Okay, and then I just put this in as well, just so you guys can see it. I will upload these slides today, don't worry. And basically how there can be positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, and how we go about this. So obviously when I was learning about this in DevPsych, it was because there's different ways to raise a child, and how to increase good behavior and decrease bad behavior, and then the different ways you can go about it. Okay. The third thing then is modeling. Okay, so that is learned behavior from observing others. Again, we're thinking DevPsych here. Children, for example, will learn dysfunctional behavior from parents. Okay, so if they see a parent thinking or acting in a certain way, they might think that's normal. I'm going to keep doing that because that's what my parents are doing. Okay, and I added this here. Children are great imitators, so give them something great to imitate. Okay, there's a very famous cartoon of this mom and dad smoking on the couch, and then the son being reprimanded for like having cigarettes. And then they said, who taught you to smoke? Okay, and then, yeah. And that's obviously like a really sad thing, because I don't think parents or caregivers always realize the effect that their behavior has on children. Okay, so that's also something we should be sensitive to as budding psychologists. And then I added this quote: children have never really been good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. Okay. And then Aaron Beck, he was basically the big guy that kind of came up with most of cognitive therapy and stuff like that. CBT, not CBD, please. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is when a therapist uses this approach to basically unlearn a lot of like thought patterns and behaviors as a result of something. So for example, I did CBT therapy for a while with the therapist actually at the counseling center, and it helped me to set much better boundaries that I thought were normal to not have with people. And it also helped me to cope with my anxiety much better, because it basically taught me to stop and be like, no, that's not the correct way of thinking. I'm being irrational right now, and then can talk myself off that ledge. Okay. The psychodynamic model, this is the fun one. Freud, if you've ever heard of him. If you haven't, then you probably have a great relationship with your mother. Okay. Here, they think that psychopathology is determined by an underlying unconscious internal force. Okay, so psychopathology, so if something's wrong with you, it's because of something deep inside of you. Okay, this is Daddy Freud. I call him Daddy Freud because he would hate if I called him Daddy Freud. So yeah, here's a meme about it, not related truly to what we're talking about now, but it might give you some context as to Freud and who he is. I actually recently bought my first Freud book. I thrifted it. So that was exciting. Okay. Basically, main idea here is they say that since sexual and aggressive instincts that we have inside us as animals. So as animals, we need to reproduce and we need to basically protect ourselves and our young. So that's sexual and aggressive instinct. Since those things have to be repressed because they are forbidden by society. So since we're not supposed to just run around and be like, hey, want to bang, like that's not socially acceptable. And since we're not supposed to just punch someone in the face if we feel vaguely threatened by them, and we have to repress those, we then express those things outwardly through psychological symptoms. Okay, so the reason we have psychological symptoms is because something deep inside of us wants to come out. Okay. The psychodynamic model, okay, so those three things that we're talking about here. So those internal forces that are fighting each other. It's your id, your ego, and your superego. Your id is deep down. You're not even conscious of the fact that it's there, but it is. Okay, it's your basic impulses, sex and aggression, seeking immediate gratification. They're irrational and impulsive. Okay, they ain't thinking. Okay, all that's on your id's mind is sex and aggression. They're not thinking about other stuff. They operate at an unconscious level. So deep inside your soul, your id is acting. Your ego then basically acts as like the mediator, where it's kind of like, okay, Ed, you're being a bit crazy right now. You need to like turn it down, like to here. Okay. So they are in charge of executive mediating between id impulses. So the impulses would be sex and aggression, and superego inhibitions, which we'll talk about just now. They're testing reality. They're rational. They operate mainly at the conscious level, but also at a pre-conscious level. What that basically means is ego is something we actively are controlling. So even though deep inside us, our brain is like sex, then on a conscious level, we're like, we're not going to bring that up in conversation right now. Grandma has just died. I'm not going to bring up sex. Okay. That's basically your ego. It's also at a pre-conscious level because it's not always there at the same time. There's something that is making your ego make that decision. Okay, that is then your superego, your conscience. Okay, so it's your ideals and morals, striving for perfection. It's incorporated from both parents. It's becoming a person's conscience. It operates mostly at a pre-conscious level. So it's that thing at the back of your mind that's basically saying, we shouldn't do that. That's wrong. Okay. Yeah. So if you want to think about it, unconscious, I always think of it like here, even though it's all in our brain and stuff like that. I think of it as like deep inside our very essence of being a human. Then our ego is here, okay, where it's basically like, don't do that. And then your pre-conscious level, I think of it as the back of your mind, that little voice, your little conscience that's basically being like, we're not going to do that today, okay, because of this reason. And then it basically breaks it up like this. Your id, I need to eat this right now, okay? Doesn't have any sense of consequences and stuff. Ego, sense of consequence. You can't do that. You're in the middle of a meeting. We're kind of busy right now. Super ego. Eating during an important meeting is rude and inappropriate. So then the super ego kind of backs up the ego. Okay. Can you please re-explain the psychodynamic model? Okay. So just to go back, psychodynamic model basically says that the reason why we have psychological symptoms that are bad is because something deep inside us, our sexual and aggressive instincts, want to come out. They want to come out, but the ego and superego are trying to stop it. They're all fighting one another, and that's what those symptoms are now coming out as. Okay. So their reasoning or their explanation for a disorder is the result of conflict between your id, ego, and superego. Okay? All these ideas of that's wrong, we shouldn't do that, all of those things, they're formed in our early childhood with our early experiences with parents or caregivers. Okay? We use defense mechanisms then to ward off pain and fear. So to prevent adverse things from happening, we may use defense mechanisms. But because of that conflict and because of then using defense mechanisms to help out with that conflict and resolve that conflict, that can now result in a disorder if it's not done in the correct way, or if it's done in a way where the id wins out. Okay? Or if your ego and superego aren't kept in check. Okay. Then an objects relations theorist basically then says that a person's primary motivation is to form relationships. So if you have an issue in an early relationship with your mom or your dad or a caregiver, there are going to be psychological problems as a result. Remember, not a steadfast rule. This is just one of the models that try to explain why these kinds of things happen. This happens to be Freud's baby. Okay, and then the final one that we're going to do today, socio-cultural or community model. This is now the big buzz area of psychology. We're all moving towards community approaches and looking at like what systemic things in society are causing psychological distress. Because we no longer have the luxury of Freud to just do cocaine and then hang out with a bunch of Swiss wives that were rich enough to afford to sit on a couch and talk about their feelings. We're now dealing with people in rural areas without access to all of these things and stuff like that. They don't care what Freud has to say. They care about the fact that my immediate environment is causing me distress. How are you going to help me as a psychologist? Or are you just going to waste my time by talking about airy fairy things? Okay. So it's very important for us to be on the ground as psychologists. Community psychology was such an amazing course that I did in honors, and they also do it in third year as well. So keep an eye out for that one. Okay, so it's basically a society's characteristics can create distress for some members of society. Okay, these can be socio-economic things, political things, and I've said they're like poverty and crime. How do those things affect people's levels of distress? Okay, think about that. We also then see, because we're talking about socio-cultural and community, so people around you and stuff, your cultural context is also going to have an effect on your experiences of mental disorders. I spoke about ukutwasa the other day, which is that ancestral calling to become an indigenous healer. So Sangoma, Igriha, all of those things. Where there, the experience of hearing a voice is a positive thing. It means that you have a gift from the ancestors. Whereas me as a Western white lady, if I came in there and didn't care about the community model or the socio-cultural model and the cultural experiences of those people, I would point to that person and say, you have schizophrenia. And that would be super crappy of me and super incorrect of me as well. Okay, we can't make those assumptions. We need to look at all of these models and come up with our best explanation for a disorder, okay, or lack of a disorder. So that's actually basically what we're going to do today. If you have any other questions, please shout. We're done. That's Murphy experiencing distress. We were driving. He was not happy about it. Okay. You can ask in the chat. You can raise your hand. You can email me. Sorry for going over time. I hope you found this interesting. And yeah, for the test, we learn everything. Everything's in the test. Remember diagrams and stuff, not the biggest thing for you to focus on, because how am I going to ask you a diagram in a multiple choice test? But everything that we've done in class, in these lectures, including the stuff tomorrow, will be in the test. How many marks? It's 30 marks, 30 questions. Same as the last one. So I think it's 45 minutes if I'm not mistaken, but I do need to double check with Mr. Zondor. Okay. At what time is the test opening? It will open on Thursday at some point and close on Friday. I think usually it's like Thursday 5 p.m. to Friday 5 p.m. yeah, since I'm quite new to this, it will literally just be whatever Elron did for you guys. Yeah, we'll just be doing the same thing. So bad voices are a disorder and good ones are a calling. Not necessarily. We can't separate those things because it's a cultural experience of hearing voices. Okay. And often people with a calling will hear bad voices, and it's because the ancestors are upset or there is distress or something going on in the community or spiritually. So yeah, especially me as a white person, I really can't give you that answer. Okay, it would be incorrect of me to do so. I have an essay related question. Which delta of THC, or does one describe THC in a broader spectrum? It's just a broad spectrum. We're not doing like the pharmacology-ness of THC. It's just generally what is THC doing in the brain. Okay. You can go into a bit of detail, but again, 6 pages, and there was quite a few aspects to get through. You might not have time to go into each like thing of THC. All right. I'm going to close there then. Thank you to everyone who attended. Yeah, if you have any other questions, please email me. I'm getting through everyone's LOA requests this week because I know a few of you could make things, and we will try and accommodate the fact that it was the first tutorial and there were some logistical issues with load shedding and stuff. So don't stress, I will be in touch. For this week, focus on your test. Don't worry about your tutorial. We'll sort that out at some other point.